Hello and welcome to our April 18th forum. We're hosting Bay Area Strike Debt. The title of today's presentation is it time for a debt jubilee? Learn about the campaign to cancel student debt, medical, and housing debt. Strike debt is a nationwide movement of debt resistors fighting for economic justice and democratic freedom. Debt is a tie that binds the 99%. With stagnant wages, systemic unemployment, and public service cuts, we are forced to go into debt for the basic things in life. This presentation will explore the current debt picture in America and what can be done to release debtors from their burdens. Today's speakers who are welcome to have are JP Masser, who's been an activist for 10 years. He's a founding member of Bay Area Strike Debt and has been involved with SDBA's struggle against unjust debt and inequality, and he's active in the fight against homelessness. Debbie Notkin is chair of the board of the Bay Area Public Bank East Bay and is an active member of Strike Debt. And our final guest, Tiffany Konyan, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology and Social Change at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I guess just before starting, I will give a little background on today's talk, which is that I've been doing research on the student debt picture, and especially since the election of Biden, where there's been talk of canceling student debt jubilee. Thought it would make for an interesting talk. I actually was lucky and left my so here's a little background on my student debt situation. I was lucky with my undergrad and had a fairly large scholarship and was able to leave without too much debt and paid it off relatively quickly. It was like my main mission in my early 20s was to just pay it off. And then once I had done that, I decided I'd go to school again and got a graduate degree, which I left with significantly more debt. I was hopeful it wouldn't be that much of an issue, but after a job loss, I was never sort of able to find employment that paid comparable wages again after that. And even though I was in a public service loan disbursement program where after 10 years, the debt would go away, it just keeps, the interest rate keeps going on student loan debt. And so after a certain number of years of that, my debt had almost doubled. It was like 40% higher than when I actually left school, even though I had been paying roughly like $450 a month on it since I graduated. And in effect, what that means in a city like San Francisco is that you have no disposable income. You have no savings, you have no retirement. Little pleasures become amazing things. And that's kind of the picture for millions of Americans. I think it's something 50 million Americans have student loan debt. The total, and this will sort of be talked about in the presentation, the total amount of student loan debt is over $1.6 trillion in America. And it would actually be much, much cheaper to just have subsidized, paid for college tuition. And that's only the student debt picture. There's other forms of debt, and we'll hear about that. So without further ado, quickly, let me just introduce Bruce, the co-host, who will mention our next forum in 2 weeks, and then we'll start the presentation. And I think you're muted, Bruce.
Okay. Yes. Somebody said the most common things people have heard now in the last years. You're muted anyway. David Bacon is going to be our guest speaker in 2 weeks on May the 2nd. He's a longtime journalist and activist. Among the books that he's written, he wrote a book called The Right to Stay Home about the situation in the countries where people are forced to flee. And he writes a regular blog, and I think he's really outstanding in the sense that he's he's one of the few people that I know that really regularly keeps in contact with migrants, especially immigrants in the field, working in the fields. He's got a vast amount of experience and knowledge about what goes on in the fields. The exact nature of his talk is not really clear, but you may know that there's a pending bill, or actually a bill that's passed the House of Representatives already, which would grant open a pathway to citizenship for 1 million farm workers. There's a lot that could be said about that. Anyway, it'd be probably talking about that, and also about what's going on at the border with the children and the whole issue of refugees seeking asylum and safety here in the United States. So anyway, so in 2 weeks, David Bacon. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And now I'll turn it over to our guest from Strike Debt.
Are we set?
We are set.
Okay, let me full screen. So I'm JP Masser, and I'll be doing the introduction. I would like to first do a little history of our organizations before we go into debt and student debt. And to clarify, we'll pretty much be talking mostly about student debt today. Maybe a little bit about medical debt. We can answer questions about debt in general, but this presentation is going to be pretty much oriented towards student debt. This is Strike Debt, and Strike Debt was formed out of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. And as our host said, it was formed to fight against all sorts of unjust debt, the kind of debt you're forced to get into, right? To stay alive, to stay healthy, and to stay educated and knowledgeable. There were a lot of really smart people who formed Strike Debt, and their big project was called the Rolling Jubilee, which you see on the screen there. And what they did with that is they figured out how to hack the system to forgive medical debt. It had to be one of the greatest hacks of all time, better than sliced bread. It ended up forgiving some $32 million worth of people's medical debt. And it generated a huge amount of publicity, getting on John Oliver, just caused an amazing amount of attention back then. And I won't go into it in great detail now, maybe later, but it basically turns out that if you donate $10, you can cause $1,000 of unpaid medical debt to simply vanish up in smoke. So that was their big project. In 2012, the Strike Debt Bay Area chapter formed, and Debbie and I are members of that. Along with the Rolling Jubilee project, we went on to do many projects on our own related to debt and finance, like advocating for public banking, like Debbie is doing, fighting against usurious payday loans and unpayable money bail and fines and fees. And we even took aim against the privatization of the commons, in particular, the privatization of the post office. A spin-off group of ours helped save the Berkeley post office from being sold off to private interests around 2016. So then in 2014, many of Strike Debt's members from New York City, who had sort of dispersed around the country, morphed the organization into the Debt Collective, a nationwide organization called the Debt Collective. And that's to which Tiffany belongs. And other people from Strike Debt took the Rolling Jubilee effort and actually made it into a nonprofit called RIP Medical Debt. since that time, since the debt collective's formation, they've basically conducted a nonstop campaign against student debt. They've been fighting in the streets, in demonstrations and protests. They've fought in the halls of Congress, up to the point where Senator Schumer and Warren called for $50,000 of student debt to be erased just a few months ago. And they fought in the courts and won major legal battles. You might have noticed that the battle has now reached the White House, and whether and how much student debt is going to be erased hangs in the balance as we speak. So while plenty of other groups have been fighting student debt, I think it's fair to say that the issue would not be the cause célèbre that it is today without the debt collective's efforts. They've just done amazing work over these last 4 or 5 years. Okay, so that's enough history. What's happened in our organizations. Let's talk about debt. Here we go. This is what consumer debt looked like on the left in 2003. We have, if you can read it, you see there's student debt, auto debt, credit card debt, home equity debt, and other debt. This doesn't include mortgage debt, standard first mortgage debt. It only includes home equity debt in the pie chart. They should be self-explanatory, except for the other category includes such things as medical debt, payday loan debt, usurious loans that people take out, and things like unpayable fines and fees, stuff like that. Okay. Now, the red slice on the left was the share of consumer debt of student debt in 2003. Now look to the right, and you see the share of student debt in 2020. You can see it's basically tripled its percentage share. And I'll show you in just a bit that it's gone up much more in magnitude than even this makes apparent. But this fact, the fact that student debt has just gone up so much as a share of what people have to pay off, right? And it's gotten so large is why we're here today talking to you about it. You know, it's just such a huge and growing problem, not just for students, but for the whole economy, as Debbie will get into a little later. So, as I said, these pie charts are percentages. Now let's look at, the next slide will show you the actual magnitude of the problem. And if you can see that, you see how student debt has gone from, in 2003, from a fairly small amount, 200 billion, which is about 5,000 per graduating student, up to what this graph shows is 1.5 trillion. The numbers vary a little, but that's basically like 40,000 per graduating student. So it's gone up by a factor of 8, and it's reached epic proportions. And just to clarify, sometimes you'll see numbers like this, 1.4 trillion, 1.5 trillion. Sometimes you'll see numbers 1.8 trillion. The difference there is whether you're talking about the federal debt owned just by the federal government. I mean, the student debt just owned by the federal government, which is about 1.4 or 1.5 trillion now, or the total student debt, which includes student debt owned by private institutions, which is around 0.3 or 0.4 trillion dollars. Okay, so that's the magnitude of the problem. now let's listen to a little video by one of the founders of Strike Debt. She was also a founder of Strike Debt Bay Area when she moved out to the Bay Area after Occupy Wall Street. And she was one of the prime founders of the Debt Collective after she became a professor at UCLA in economic anthropology. Her name is Hannah Appel. So this is Student Debt 101.
Today, student debt in the United States stands at $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion. My family has about 75,000 of that 1.7 trillion. Do you know someone with student debt? I know you know someone with student debt because there are 43 million of us in this country. And this is the first thing I want you to understand. You are not alone. You are not a loan. Your student debt is not your fault. If there were just a few 100,000 people across the country with student debt, it would be easy to say, oh, those are just some people who made bad financial decisions, or, oh, they got scammed. But we're not talking about a handful of people. We are talking about a broken-ass system. 43 million of us went to college to try to make a better life for ourselves and our families. We did what we were supposed to do, what we were told to do. And today, we owe $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion. You don't need a financial literacy class. You need a movement to abolish all student debt. And we have that movement.
Okay. So what happened, from the year 2000 or so to make student debt go from almost being non-existent to incredibly massive? Here's Hannah again with a little history of that, particularly attuned to what happened in California.
Public college used to mean free college. Free college. So even in 1999, there was basically no student debt. Today, there's 1.7 trillion. What the f happened? In the 1960s, protests spread across college campuses against the Vietnam War, for free speech, the Brown Berets, the Black Panthers, feminist movements. In the wake of these uprisings, this guy, governor of California, said that for the first time, the University of California should charge tuition. He actually said,
those there to agitate might think twice how much they want to pay to carry a picket sign.
In other words, when Black and brown folks demanded access to public colleges as places where you could study Chicanx history or denounce imperialist wars or build student power, Reagan said, oh yeah? Then pay for it. This is what happens when education is a privilege, not a right. Let me say it again. Public college used to be free. It should be again, and it can be again. We need to abolish student debt and bring back free college, but this time for all.
Yeah, so as you probably realized, once the idea of college in California became that it wasn't free tuition, the university and the state were free to keep raising the tuition and raising the tuition and raising the tuition, et cetera, et cetera. And the brakes have never been put on. So now I'm going to turn you over to Debbie Notkin, who's going to give you a more in-depth view of things.
Well, thanks, JP. What I'm going to give you a more in-depth view of is student debt. And what I hope you can see is my screen and not my notes. The graph on my screen and not my notes, but screen sharing can be weird. Please move this window away from the shared application. Wait, let me see how I can do that. Okay, so Nathan said at the beginning that we were going to talk about all kinds of debt, but we really did set up to talk primarily about student debt. And we'll be happy to answer your questions about other debt. But here's sort of more facts about student debt. The first student loans in the United States were offered exclusively to students at Harvard in 1840. There was no federal student loans until 1965, so well within my lifetime. The GI Bill in 1944 subsidized or completely covered the cost of college education for nearly half of America's returning World War II veterans. I will leave you to guess what color the unsubsidized half were, what skin color the unsubsidized half had, something I didn't realize until recently. And my own family wealth, such as it is built significantly on the fact that my father had access to GI Bill funds. The GI Bill is still real today, but it is way, way, way reduced in power and in how much it offers. It's not the same for contemporary veterans as it was after World War II. By 1986, you got some of this from Hannah too. Federal student loans were about $10 billion. And we find that graduates with liberal arts degrees have the highest debt burden because they get less subsidy and the most challenge repaying because in general, liberal arts jobs pay less than scientific or technical or medical jobs. So what happened? A couple of things happened. One is that tuition rates skyrocketed at public universities, starting with what Hannah was talking about with penalizing students for free speech. You got a situation where tuition at public four-year colleges increased by 73% in the 10 years between 1999 and 2009. And the reason that happened is the neoliberalists pushed state governments to put less and less and less money into their state college systems. That's gone down about 28% since 2008 and a good deal more before that. And then federal funding also went down. State per student funding in 1990 was 140% more than it was of the federal government spent. Now it's just 12% more. So as that spending decreased, it had to be made up by something. And what it was made up by was tuition. But in particular, it was made up by tuition that was borrowed because many, many, many students, particularly in state-funded colleges, come because the tuition is cheap. And as the tuition went up, they borrowed more and the debt went up. In 1987, students paid about 23% of the cost to fund their education. By 2012, that was over 45%. So the numbers just keep going up. The burden keeps going up. And meanwhile, something else that happened way back in 1965 is that it was decided, I don't know by whom, that student loans could not be discharged in bankruptcy. Medical debts, as awful as they are, you can go into bankruptcy, you can walk away from your medical debts. The same is true of credit card debts. Most of us know somebody who's been through a bankruptcy, sometimes more than one, but your student debts are with you. Bankruptcy does not affect them. The details of how that works have changed many times since '65, but the basic deal is the same. And so now you see people whose Social Security checks are being garnished to pay student loans, not that their kids incurred, but that they incurred 30, 40 years ago. It's pretty horrible. So student debt, like everything else in this country, is not equitably distributed. I am having trouble seeing my notes, so hang on one second. Let me figure out a better way to do this. See if that works. It's not equitably distributed. It's very racialized. Just last week, you may have seen this in the news, Elizabeth Warren held a hearing about student debt. She is the chair of the subcommittee on economic policy of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. She opened the hearing by highlighting how student loan debt exacerbates the racial wealth gap. noting that after 20 years, the median Black borrower still owes 95% of the original amount borrowed. Now, Nathan isn't Black, but he basically was telling you that same story. Black and African American college graduates graduate owing $25,000 more in student loan debt than white college graduates, and they're the most likely to struggle financially due to student loan debt, 29% making monthly payments of $350 or more. A lot of factors go into that. One is the wealth of their families going in and how much their families can help them. Dorothy Brown, who has just written a book called The Whiteness of Tax, what's it called? It's not exactly The Whiteness of Taxes, hold up. It is called something that I will find in a second. The Whiteness of Wealth. Talks about how many Black students send money back to their families while they're in college, while their white counterparts are often getting money from their families. So these are the factors that impact the racialization of student debt. Student debt is also very gendered. Women hold 58% of all student loan debt, and it takes women an average of 2 years longer to pay off their student loan debts, even though they make higher payment, as a group, they make higher payments. So Senator Warren, who's arguing for $50,000 per person, per debtor in student loans to be forgiven, gives the statistic that that would relieve 36 million borrowers completely of their debt burdens. You heard Hannah's number that 43 million Americans are in debt. So that would reduce it, the 36 minus 43, reduce it to just 7 million. You still don't want 7 million people in student debt, but it would clearly be better. And 3 million of those borrowers that Warren's proposal would free have carried those debt burdens for over 20 years. She also says that that $50,000 would close the Black-white wealth gap among borrowers by 25 points, and for Latinos, between Latinos and whites, by 27 points. And when I hear these numbers, I think about the numbers that are being talked about in terms of the child tax credit that passed with the ARPA, which is projected to reduce child poverty by 45 to 50% in this country. And, you know, with all of that, we just have one question, which is for Senator Warren and everyone: why just $50,000? Why not all of it? And here is one more visit from our favorite Hannah Appel.
$1.7 trillion of student debt. College education making our society less equal. Black women holding a disproportionate share of student debt. Shit show. How can we change this system? How can we, student debtors, have power over this system? Simple. What if I told you that our debts make us powerful? Don't take it from me, take it from this guy. As this famous capitalist once said, if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. In other words, when you owe that much, you have power over the bank. At $1.7 trillion, we own the bank. If we organize, we can use that $1.7 trillion as leverage over a failed system. This is what we do with the Debt Collective. We organize debtors' unions. In 2014, we launched the nation's first student debt strike. And as of today, that strike has won over $1 billion in student debt abolition. We won under Obama, we won under Trump, even though Betsy DeVos canceled those debts with extreme displeasure, damn right, Betsy, and we can keep winning under Biden. When we build power, when we organize, we win.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany, who's going to talk about things that can be done, action items. And in a minute, I'll share my screen again with her flyer.
Sure. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, JP. And thanks for everyone here today to talk with us about student loan debt and other types of debts that are ultimately burdens on so many people in the United States. And ultimately to invite you to join us in this fight, in whatever fight you find yourself in, whether that's student debt, medical debt, or housing debt, but learning how we can organize together in order to change the narrative around what debt means to people. Because since I've been organizing with the Debt Collective, so I've been hosting a local chapter, Bay Area Debtors Union, since November, and I've been studying debt for the last 5 years and researching the impacts of indebtedness on our subjectivities, on how we think about education, on how we think about ourselves and each other ultimately. So we want to invite you to take any of the actions. I put the flyer link in the chat as well, but you can always learn more and become a member of our National Debtors Union at thedebtcollective.org. We invite you to watch and share any of the Debt Collective's videos. So there's a link there to the videos we shared today, and there's several more featuring Professor Hannah Appel. There's also a link to another recent interview with the press secretary for the Debt Collective, Braxton Brewington, which gives a very relevant, in the moment take on some of Joe Biden's decisions and statements since he's been in office. So when Joe Biden won the election last year, the Debt Collective started a campaign of 100 strikers, 100 days. So a push to both educate people about student debt, but also to call on Joe Biden to use his power through executive order to cancel these debts. So since January, we've been in a campaign. We had a week of action a few weeks ago. So through that, there's also been 3 petitions started. So you can sign any and all of those petitions coming out of the Debt Collective, the Youth Democratic Socialists of America, as well as a local group, SF Rising, who have been organizing around College for All. They also have a petition through Student Action. So we're also encouraging people to contact local representatives. So let Nancy Pelosi know that if this matters to you, let Senator Feinstein and Senator Padilla know that student debt is an important topic to you or people in your community. You can also take that call to the White House directly. So exercising that democracy through a message on social media or a letter to the White House, even to call on Joe Biden to cancel all student debt. We ask that you share and discuss this topic with friends and family. So there's the social media for both the National Debt Collective Strike Debt, as well as Strike Debt Bay Area and the Bay Area Debtors Union. Part of what we're encouraging as well is to support and build coalition with intersecting movements and organizations in your own area. So some things that have been going on around rent and mortgage strikes, folks teaming up to push back against people losing their homes during the pandemic. There's in different states, there's, every state has different utility laws, but in California, there's many groups who are organizing around utilities and pushing back against private utilities that then create unfair burdens and debt burdens on people. And as well as we have a fellow working locally who's part of the National Debt Collective team who's working on a tool for disputing bail debt for folks who are incarcerated, and all of the fees and costs that are associated with that create even more burdens on folks. So you know, the debt is a very intersectional issue. It affects people from many backgrounds and many identities, and it also plays into other issues that people are having. So there's many opportunities that you can get involved locally with folks who have already been doing work and bring in this kind of debt lens and see how debt is affecting those situations. And then, you know, to host a community info event, such as Nathan's doing here, you're all doing right now. Or you could do a debt fundraiser in support of your community. So like JP mentioned earlier, the Rest in Peace medicaldebt.org, you can actually coordinate a group, your own local group, to collect money specifically to pay off debts in your area. So you can coordinate a local campaign, or you could donate to the overarching group. Did you want to say anything else about that, JP? Oh, you're muted. If anybody else has questions on that, they're just JP and Debbie are very knowledgeable on that group. And number 9, we ask you to add your ideas for action. You know, you have your own experience and your own relationship to the issue of debt, and each local community probably has their own solutions to that. So we always encourage that you start where you are and work within what you know and what you all feel called to do. So we welcome you to reach out anytime. Both of our emails are down there, and we can share a little bit, like the Bay Area Debtors Union. We have a weekly meeting on Wednesdays, and then Strike Debt Bay Area has been hosting a monthly reading group. So that actually got postponed till next week if you're interested. And I think that's it for the actions, and we open it up to any questions, thoughts, comments, stories.
I'll just drop in quickly on the RIP medical debt and say that in 2019, JP and I, with help from some other people in Strike Debt, and from one other person whom we didn't know before, organized an East Bay campaign. And JP will correct me on the numbers, but if I remember correctly, we raised $15,000, and we caused the forgiveness of nearly $1.5 million in East Bay medical debt. It's an amazing, amazing thing to do. And it's one of the things I've done that I feel the best about. And with that, we're happy to open it up to questions, comments. You guys are UUs. You will have plenty to say. I trust you.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany, JP, and Debbie. Maybe while people sort of put their questions either in the chat, or there's not that many of us here, we can just kind of open it up and talk. You know, I had a comment, or I guess a thought and a question. The thought was, you know, as I'm watching this and just thinking about the scale of this, right? Like almost every single American, if you're not careful, or even if you are careful, is going to incur some amount of debt in their life just to try and maintain their standard of living or even advance themselves, right? So if the notion is I want to go to college and maybe find a better job, I've come to view student loan debt in mine as just as paying an extra tax, right? So I wanted to go to college and maybe find a higher paying career. Well, that means that I'm, you know, my effective tax rate is now 15% higher than everyone else around me. And it's totally random in some ways based on the interest rates at the time, you know, year to year. And rather than it just being, oh, we need an educated population, you know, it's a social good for everyone to seek out an education. It's more like, well, you're going to take on some level of debt and it's going to be unspecified, you know, year to year, and we're going to make it really hard to discharge. So I guess that was the one comment. And then how it restructures, once you're in this situation, it sort of restructures your worldview, what you can do, being able to move, things of that nature. And really just, it becomes, in my view, especially because student loan debt is through the federal government, if you get federal financial aid, it starts to just feel like an extra tax that you're paying every year. I had one question though. You had mentioned earlier on about medical debt, how every, what was it, $10 donated turned into $100 dispersed. How did that work? And are you still fundraising for that, or are there campaigns still working about that?
JP, do you want to take that and then I'll chip in?
Sure. So we're not still fundraising for that. But as I mentioned, there's a nonprofit, ripmedicaldebt.com, that is fundraising for that on a national level. They've raised enough money to buy off $4 billion worth of medical debt so far. So how does it work? So it's like I said, it's an amazing hack. And so you have to understand what happens when you go to the hospital and you incur a debt and you owe it to the hospital and you don't pay it, right? So they try and collect, and they can't collect. So what do? They don't want to be in this business. They sell that debt to a debtor's market. There is a literal market out there in medical debt that buys debt from hospitals and doctors and whatever, right? So if the hospital can't collect immediately, they'll sell it onto this market. Maybe they'll sell it for like 20 cents on the dollar, right? So I go onto this market, I buy a whole package of debt for, $200,000, and now I have the right to collect $1 million worth of medical debt from all the people in this package of debt. Okay, so I start harassing these people, right? I call them, I call their family, I threaten them, blah, 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 blah. Maybe some of them pay up, right? Maybe some of them don't. They just don't have any money. They can't pay, right? So now what do I do with this debt? Well, I've basically given up on it. I now throw it back onto the debt market and sell it again at an even lesser price to these low-level vultures, if you will, right? Debt vultures.
Bottom feeders.
Bottom feeding vultures at 1 or 2 cents on the dollar, right? So there's all this debt out there on this regulated, perfectly legal debt market, right? That you can buy up if you are a registered agent for a penny on the dollar, all right? And the debt collected people dug into it, figured this all out, figured out what was happening, and figured out how to become a registered agent to buy this debt, right? So then they started raising money, and they, got hundreds of thousands of dollars together, and then they started buying medical debt. And as they bought the medical debt, they ripped it up. They sent letters to people saying, hey, you owe, $10,000 to, and I'm the legal owner of that debt now, and you don't have to pay it. And they just ripped it up. So all these people all around the country got letters in their mailboxes saying, you're no longer going to have to worry about this particular medical debt. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, sorry.
Go on, Nathan.
Oh, I was just saying, it's fascinating because it just makes me think that the actual value of the product then, or the service that's been rendered in this situation, like healthcare, is so incredibly overvalued from what it actually costs, right? So it's essentially, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds as though, you get this bill, but it doesn't seem pegged to like anything real, right? So if they're gonna try and collect and they can't collect, and then they'll sell it on this market for 20 cents on the dollar, and whoever buys that, I guess they'll get the difference, that 80%. But if they don't, it's not like the hospital shuts down. It's not like things came to a screeching halt. It's just, we're all overpaying for everything so that this market can exist and people can try and collect every single penny that they can if they want to. And if they don't, though, I don't know.
Well, not only is that true, Nathan, and I think that's a really useful explanation of it, But the thing I always say is you can't pay off your medical debt at 20 cents on the dollar or 2 cents on the dollar. Only these financialized companies can. And, you know, if you think about what would happen if this became a service that was available to the individual debtor. If you know you got your bill from the hospital, and hospital bills can effortlessly be $500,000 if you had a surgery and you were there for a week or whatever, and you get your $500,000 bill, and if you could call the hospital and say, look, I don't have $500,000, I can't pay $500,000, it's ridiculous, but over time I might be able to pay you $100,000. How do you feel about that? Right? If you could have that conversation with the hospital, there would be some human interaction in the mix. But instead, the hospital will continually tell you that you have to pay every penny. And when they sell your debt, they won't tell you that. The person who calls you doesn't say, I'm from Nathan's Bill Collectors. He says, I'm from St. Jude Hospital. And so there's this, not only is it hidden, not only is it unfair and shifted to the financialized, but it's also hidden and completely untransparent. Sure. And you don't know what's happening to your debt. And yes, the whole system could be rejiggered based on the amount they actually get.
Yeah,
right.
And I didn't know about that system, and it just makes me feel more and more like, well, there, you know, Medicare for all would just sort of cover that, and the rest of this just sounds like a whole bunch of hoops to jump through and tiny print.
Right.
And the rich get richer.
Yeah, and the rich get richer. Are there, Tiffany, you have a comment?
I just wanted to comment that, like the medical loan, the medical debt packages, there's a similar thing for student loans. So they're called SLABs, student loan asset-backed securities. So people who default on their student debt also have their loans chopped up like they did with the housing market and sold off to these, you know, to the debt collectors at a fraction of the cost. So then they can try to collect. And I just wanted to add that in, since these markets exist pretty much wherever there's debt. There's then these, you know, businesses whose sole purpose is to buy up defaulted debt at fractions of the cost and, you know, basically take ownership of people's lives until that debt is relinquished.
Can I ask a question really quick on that? So if it's an asset-backed security and it's bought by sort of a collection agency and they aren't able to collect, who's backing that asset? Is the federal government then going to pay the debt collectors? They won't release the debt from students, and which is at this point just about, you know, some significant portion of America, but they will back that asset for the debtor, banker, monopoly hat wearing people.
That's
is that the situation?
This is the predatory nature of student loans, because that's exactly ultimately what's happening, right? They're extracting a certain amount of wealth by putting people, like they cut the amount that they're spending to educate people, and that cost comes then from students, and those who don't have intergenerational wealth end up, you know, in that situation. The
government backs that debt not for the students, but for the banker class.
Bingo.
Correct.
But also remember that $0.4 trillion worth of that debt is private student debt. So it's not backed by the federal government. So there's a huge market in that, right?
As well.
And just Nathan, the fact that you didn't know about it until Rolling Jubilee was established in probably about 2011, 2012, I think almost nobody that wasn't in the financial markets was aware of it. I think that's really when it became somewhat more public knowledge that this goes on.
Do we have? Sorry,
I have a question.
Sure.
There's a question in the chat, but I think I answered it. But
Yeah, you answered the question. I put that one in the chat. Well, my other question is like, okay, it's like I really have a difficult time understanding, this whole financial thing. I know what I generally understand in a very vague way is that production used to be the main source of wealth. And I mean, ultimately is the main source of wealth, right? I mean, people produce things and they get sold, and that's where wealth comes from, right? It's from people working and producing. Anyway, but in the last period of history, finance has sort of taken over the generation of at least money, if that makes any sense. And then you were talking about Reagan, and I'm not you guys, but the video was talking about Reagan used that, that leverage over the students to extract revenge against the students for protesting. But isn't, how much of this we're talking about here with this debt thing, it has to do with the fact that sort of the basic way this whole economy functions is now based on these financial finaglings and all that kind of stuff.
A lot.
Yeah.
And let me come in here for two things. One is a good way to think about the shift from production to financialization is that General Motors credit system that helps people buy cars is now much bigger in terms of the General Motors profits than the actual making of the cars. That's kind of a good snapshot of what that shift looks like. And then I was going to say, because I've been working so closely and intimately with banking because of my public bank work, which is a whole nother conversation. The whole thing is so crazy that inside a bank, a debt is an asset and money in the bank is a problem. Mm. Because money in the bank isn't doing anything. Right. One of the things banks try to do is minimize the amount of money they have on hand, which is just, you have to take a long time to wrap your brain around it. And then I will let JP come in.
Just another aspect of the financialization of the world. These figures might not be exactly correct, but it used to be, 50, 60, whatever years ago, that the finance sector in the US was like 5% of GDP. And now it's gone up to like 20 or 25%. So it's just totally massive. And it's money. And as you're saying, it's no longer production, it's money making money. Right. And you can have, our philosophical arguments for forever about, the wealth of nations and where wealth comes from and whatever. But it's pretty clear that such a huge amount of resources dedicated to money making money is pretty pointless. I mean, so many of my colleagues.
It's 2:00.
Oh no.
Sorry.
So many of my colleagues graduated with technical degrees, mathematics degrees, went into Wall Street firms, doing fancy mathematical models for stocks and derivatives and stuff. It's almost sad. I mean, they made shitloads of money, yes, but it's still sad that the productive and intellectual capabilities of the country were diverted so much into that.
Maybe can I jump in with an analogy? So I know, kind of going off of what Bruce was saying about wealth being, historically coming from production. In my hometown, there was a General Electric factory that was 1 mile by 1 mile square, like very large facility, and they produced wind turbines and locomotives, right? So heavy industry. And what a lot of people in the town didn't know before the GE really sort of tanked maybe a decade ago, was that GE since the 70s onward had essentially transformed itself into a financial institution, right? So you would interact with GE in terms of like light bulbs and microwaves, and you kind of knew they did some heavy industry stuff in there. But what they were really doing is all the heavy industry, they don't actually sell the things, right? They lease locomotives. You can't buy one anymore. So they extract wealth that way. And then after the lifetime of that is over, then they'll sell it again, or maybe lease it again under different terms. And then when they were generating that profit, they were then reinvesting it. And GE kind of got into the situation where rather than making things, they made what they needed to generate profits to then invest it again. And then those investments went belly up. And then they started shutting down actual production. So when they shut down the factory in my hometown, they shut down a profitable factory that employed like 4,000 people because they needed cash to cover losses in the financial market. And the locomotive was only a vehicle for them to get cash, for these money managers to get cash for the GE financial side, because GE was actually 70% a bank. And it sounds something very similar, like kind of what is happening with student loans, other than it's like the terms are rigged so that the debt collectors get it, but it's a product, right? Think of, it's not just a loan, it exists in like digital space. It's like a physical thing that's like traded all over the place that I have no control or say in. And actually a lot of people like Caterpillar as a heavy industry, that's what they do. They're heavy industry, right? They make the bulldozers and backhoes and things. They're like 70% a financial institution that's just like making money off of money. And the thing that they're selling is just a way to get the money to invest. And I'll cut myself there.
Let me just want to ask one more question. I'd like to hear other people. If $50,000 were, or the entire student debt loan burden was lifted from people, it's obvious that a lot of people's lives would be improved and all that. But who stands to lose? Is it just like people who own stock in these banks, people who are just like investors? Where does the loss come in?
Well, what I was just going to say, because Nathan just so clearly laid all that out, is that's who's opposed to loan forgiveness, are the people whose money comes from the loans as things, the debts as things, right? So there's a very substantial, very wealthy lobby that includes the big Wall Street banks and people like American Express. Not a lot of people know, but most of the predatory loan storefronts that you see on your street corners are partly owned by the big banks. The big banks don't want to get into that business themselves. They just want some of the money from it. So there's a very complicated conversation about how much the government needs the student debt repayment income. And you could get into it for hours and not settle it. But what is obvious to me, and Nathan talked about this also very clearly, is if you don't have to pay $450 a month in repaying your student loans, you spend that money in your community. You move, you might buy a car, you might have a kid, you might take a vacation, and the money will circulate and the tax revenue will go up, right? This is actually something that nobody has said that's really important. Forgiving student debt is a huge way to rebuild the middle class. It's not the only way. It's not the only way, but I'm about to be 70, and when I was growing up, there was a robust middle class, and now there isn't. Now there's most Americans identify as middle class, but what that means now is struggling, often not having $400 for an emergency expense. Who goes to payday lenders is a bigger and bigger group every year, and while it is certainly disproportionately black and brown. It's not only black and brown, and it's not only poor anymore either. So what happens is the whole economy thrives, but that's not, it doesn't feed the predators, and it doesn't answer the questions of the deficit hawks. Is how I would put it.
From
It's
our
almost like the
understanding.
vacuum cleaners everywhere, like one step removed, in a sense. You know, like once a month I would go in and pay my student loans, and I'd have all this anxiety. And then it would go away for, 3 weeks, and then about a week before I had to pay my next one. And I actually didn't have it on auto pay because I was so paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
I wanted to, I didn't want to actually try and imagine, a scenario where there wasn't enough in there to even cover the auto pay. So it's like there's this vacuum cleaner out there that has a slick website that you never see, you never talk to, you'll spend 2 hours on their helpline, and they're just vacuuming the money, like invisible vacuum machines everywhere.
Well, one of the things that came up at the Elizabeth Warren hearing last week was the CEO of Naviance was there. And she, from what I've read, she raked him over the coals.
Good.
About Naviance being sued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They have incredibly poor service ratings. Navient, for anybody who doesn't know, is probably the biggest servicer of federal student loans. Tiffany and Nathan probably know the name extremely well. But anyway, so Navient is in Warren's sites. I recommend there are some good articles that came out after that hearing. I can put a link in the chat if people want to see one.
Sure, yeah, put it in the chat.
I'll do that right now.
Just to give you some idea of the macroeconomic impact. So there's like $1.4 trillion worth of federalized student debt, right? If that were just forgiven, right, then it's not like that money suddenly just vanishes. It's the government is getting this money back over time, right? Right now it's being repaid slowly, and something like, $100 billion a year is flowing from people who owe the money back to the federal government, right? Every year, based on the interest and the repayments of principal. So when you think about $100 billion in terms of what we're spending now, per year, that's, it sounds like a lot of money, $100 billion, but we just spent $2 trillion, right? And we spend $800 billion on defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the macroeconomic effect on the government is not very big, but on each individual person, the effect of that is going to be fairly big. And as Debbie said, you've got this boost to the economy. So the federal government is actually going to benefit from the increase in the economy. So it's not even that they're going to lose $100 billion a year, right? They're going to gain some from the increased economy. So it just gives you an order of magnitude idea of what's going on, or what would go on.
Do we have
How about somebody who hasn't said anything?
Yeah.
Questions, thoughts, experiences?
Well, in the meantime, maybe I'll interject a comment. And I don't have the link off the top of my head, but I read somewhere once that essentially said that financial vehicles like student loans are how the federal government has made up for all the tax cuts, pretty much since George W. Bush onward in 2000, right? So it actually tracks really nicely with the chart where from 2000 onwards, student loan debt has gone up, and that as they've cut taxes or given tax breaks to the already wealthy, the ways that the federal government has found to fund itself have become more obscure. So student loan debt is actually one of them. And instead of sometimes I think of like the way that they operate is they come up with these very obscure things. They tell you it's a benefit, and then no one is really helped in the long run. But that and that's part of why I view my student loan debt as just an extra tax. And I think it's a helpful way to think about it. But I mean, if you imagine instead of cutting taxes on the rich, the taxes were raised on the rich and then school was free for everyone, it would just be a completely different scenario.
Right.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, but honestly, I've recently, and this is not about debt, it's recently been pointed out to me, I think the government hasn't made up a lot of those shortfalls from tax cuts. And I think somebody pointed out to me and I went, well, that's obvious once somebody tells me. The Republicans want short government money because otherwise they have no excuse not to create entitlements. Right? If the government has enough money, the argument against free college or significant Social Security or Medicare for all is a much harder argument than if you can just say, oh, we're broke. We'd do that for you, but we're broke. You got to feel for us. We can't do it. So there is a big push on the right. You know, we all know that deficits rise in Republican administrations. And I never thought clearly about why until someone pointed that out to me.
Right, it's manufactured austerity.
Exactly.
Maybe Tiffany, I know in our previous conversation, we had
Robin
talked
has a
about the way that.
I have a comment.
Yeah, Robin, jump in.
I've learned a lot. And Debbie, I've learned a great deal from you. I've really found, but I've also learned a lot also from JP and Tiffany. And I knew that we were not producing anything anymore. And I sort of wondered how we were what we were substituting it with. And the financialization of all of our services or quote unquote goods is where that's coming from. And it's just a kind of terrible, absurd sort of, I mean, I kind of a house of cards that just keeps getting higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. And so is there an end to it? Is there something that could happen that would cause a crash far worse than 2008, say?
Absolutely. There's absolutely an end like that, which is why the debt collective and the organizing groups that want a soft landing are so crucial.
Well, can you
raising your hand, or is
That's
that
me raising my hand. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think Robin still had a.
Oh, I'm sorry.
follow-up.
Well, I just wasn't sure what you meant when I said what actually could happen to bring the house of cards down, and nobody would really have anything.
Well,
Could that happen?
Could I mean, ultimately that's kind of what the debt collective is pushing with the student debt strikers, because we're already the moratorium during the so there's been a student debt moratorium issued since Trump was still in office last year. So for the last year, they have been, their books are at zero. No one is required to pay unless you have a private loan or a certain type of loan that doesn't qualify. They were like certain people who had loans in a period between when the government fully started issuing issuing the loans as well as backing them. Because up until like 2010, the government they didn't actually issue the loans. They just backed private, other private banks who would create the loans and the government would be responsible to them. But since 2010, they create the loans and they back them. So I think that this is part of so when we stopped paying, this is part of the aha is nothing, what happened, who's stopped making the money? And it's like these fringe loan servicers.
Yeah, the vultures have been swooping in, and each of them asks for so little that nobody comes down on them. Whereas a big corporation would be asking for a huge chunk. That must be part of it.
And can I just jump in really quickly? If you don't have student loans, you might not know this, but the interest rates are set I think the high point, or at least my high point, is like 7.8 something. I think the high point's 8%, which is fairly high. And I don't think that any of mine were below 3.75. And it changes year to year, but they kind of just stay higher than any other type of loan you might consider.
So I just want to get back to Robin, what I think is Robin's bigger question, which is what is the, if nothing gets better, what does the actual collapse look like? And I don't feel like an expert on that. I don't feel like I have a good answer, but what I'm going to say is it looks like 2008 on steroids.
Yeah, that's what I would think, maybe.
It looks like 2008 affecting 10 times as many people.
I mean, if it's clear that nobody learned any lessons from 2008, right?
Yeah.
So the amount of financialization in the system has only gone up. The propensity of these people to invent incredibly complicated financial arrangements continues to go up. So a repeat of something like 2008, it will be different. It will be in some other sector, probably, something that no one is really looking at, but we'll look back in retrospect as, of course, right? Just like 2008 happened.
The other thing
that's one scenario. Another scenario of collapse is obviously another pandemic of significantly greater proportions would cause a complete collapse of the economic system around the country.
If the supply chains fail.
Right.
What about the devalue? They're talking about, I somehow have on a mailing list for conservatives as well as for liberals. So I keep getting warnings about how the dollar is going to be devaluated and you ought to take all your money out of the bank.
I've been seeing those warnings for the last 50 years. So
okay.
I wouldn't put too much,
That's not an immediate concern.
But another thing that happened after 2008 that has happened after every previous big depression is depressions are historically have always been followed by increased bank regulation. And that did not happen after 2008. There were little tiny, pecks at it, but nothing big because the bankers run the government.
Okay. Yeah.
If you're worried about the dollar in the future, what you want to look at is what everybody in the world thinks about the dollar. And that's reflected in the interest rate that treasury bonds get, which is absurdly low right now. 10-year, 30-year treasury bonds, people are dying to buy them at ridiculously low prices, right? So the interest rates are really low. So no one in the world thinks the dollar is going to collapse, except for gold bugs and, now they could be wrong, but anyway.
Interesting. Horrible.
I think we had a few other people wanting to ask questions.
Jeffrey had his hand up and then he disappeared.
Oh yeah.
Needed to leave.
Yep.
Well, anybody, if there's any questions that come up after, feel free to reach out. This is definitely an ongoing conversation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I have a question for Tiffany. I know in our previous time we were chatting, I think some of your research is on sort of the subjectivity of being a debtor, right? So this feeling of like what actually happens to the person when they're in debt. But I was just thinking about the comment earlier with austerity and the video, right? So we went from a situation where college was free. In effect, I mean, people left with a little bit of loan. It wasn't entirely free, but compared to today, it was free, I guess. Or you could
pay their loans off in 2 years.
Right, you could pay it off fairly quickly. To then essentially that being eroded over the years until now with this sort of perpetual austerity that we're told we're in. We're told we should be thankful for our 8% loans and that we're deadbeats for not having paid them. And that's quite a dramatic shift from the 50 years, 1970 to 2020. What does, I mean, do you have thoughts on like what that does to a culture, to a society? Does some of your research go into that? Tiffany, do you have?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier how, there's material consequences, like you can't, maybe move into a larger place, or people not having kids, not getting married. It has those kind of material consequences on what people choose to do. But it also changes the way people think. So you have in the 60s, the majority of people going into higher education, which, looked a lot different back then, like who had access to education, even when it was public, and you can get into debates about equity there and how, around access and what people actually need to be in school, because you not only are paying the tuition, but you're paying for your costs, all the costs of living. So, a lot of people didn't have that opportunity, when school, even when schools were free. There was a lot of, delineations within the spectrum of society of who could be in school. But in general, the people who were going to school were there to, enhance their way of thinking, to learn, to actually like gain skills and tools, but the social capital that now, you do a survey now, and most people who are what they're choosing to go to school for is based on how much money they can make.
Yeah.
And when you connect, like, the fact that even historically, you have how universities have been used as places of innovation, as places of research that then are connected to private industries, who are then taking the work that's being produced by students and making money off of it in a privatized way. So so all of these things, it's like who decides what's valuable, who decides, what's worth knowing, who decide, like, ultimately, if you go to an institution, they're only getting funding for STEM, they're only getting subsidies for certain fields that are going to cycle back into that, either maintain a status quo or that cycle then into private extraction. So that whole, the fact that people then are proud for paying for college when it was something that, like, we're working to do, it's actual labor. And that's part of the work, is looking at, like, the wages for housework movement, Sylvia Federici, feminist movement around the unpaid labor of women and care. And school, there was a similar campaign, Wages for Schoolwork, in the 70s, that was also saying, we're doing work, we're going to be applying these skills within our communities. So there's graphs out there that you can see that when student loans came into existence, wages stagnated, unpaid internships became a thing, where all of a sudden people expected you to go spend another several years not getting paid to do work to then get allowed in. So there's, it creates a false narrative as well, saying, like, oh, you're going to earn $1 million more if you go to college. Like these, these kind of
It'll
myths.
pay for itself.
Yeah. But then it doesn't account for it. Well, if we don't have the medical insurance and something happens to you, how do you then pay that back? There's so many things that get in the way because of this financialization, that it impacts how we live our lives, what we think about, literally what we are thinking about, what we do with our time. It's one, Maurizio Lazzarato, he's an Italian thinker. He looks at the neoliberalization of higher education in the United States as a literal means of creating a subjectivity of indebtedness, that your future is collapsed upon. They are targeting these young people because they don't know what that means to be then indebted for the next 30 years of their lives. So just lastly, the cancellation argument, and I think more importantly than anything, like, there's several groups that are are dealing with student loan as a crisis, but the Debt Collective is the only one that was really pushing for full cancellation of all debt and seeing it as a global issue, very national issue, but also a global issue. And so, yeah, I think I lost my train of thought, but
Lazzarotti.
Well, it was about the cancel. Oh, this conversation of cancellation. Now they're interrogating all these systems that are failing. So the fact that, it's becoming more clear how predatory and how the system is actually operating just how it was meant to, by by making sure that people are being individually held responsible for these debts, rather than it being something that the state and industry has also responsibility to. So there's the income repayment plans, the public loan service forgiveness plans that teachers and people working within community are supposed to qualify for. All those systems have been made to not work, and that's also becoming, now they're trying to push forward the bankruptcy. They're trying to push forth. They're going to try to find any way to fix this system so they can continue to make money off of people for something that used to, is work, is labor, is a social responsibility. So that's a lot.
That's enough. That's enough. My head is bursting.
We can stop. We can stop.
I just had if I could just say something or question, because and Nathan and I have been talking about this book, The Sum of Us, and Heather McGee talks a lot about the different aspects of this society that are distorted and twisted and contorted, and because of white supremacy and racial injustice and all that sort of thing. And I'm wondering how much that particular issue may be factored into this, because just recently I became a German citizen, right? I mean, it's a long story, but part of the reason because in the EU, like I have granddaughters and stuff like that. In the EU, you can go to school for free.
Right.
Okay. You can go to college for free, right? So they're exploiting countries, like the United States is an exploiting country, but they manage to provide more benefits for the people that within their borders, but they don't have the same kind of history of racial insanity that this country has. So anyway, I'm just wondering, is that a significant factor in this whole insane system we're talking about?
It's my personal, the United States has an absolutely unique strain of individualism, anti-socialism, anti-anything that protects its citizens. And it's Tiffany just said something really interesting in the chat, but it's my personal belief that the reason for that strain in the United States is racism. That we would be much, much more willing to have Medicare for all, to have no student debt, if it didn't mean that some Black person somewhere might get something they didn't deserve. Yeah. I feel like that is the heart of United States inequity. And it's not like there isn't inequity in other places, but Europe has a much deeper social democratic tradition. And I kind of envy you and your German citizenship. But I think it's racist at its core. Yeah. And I put this in my bio, and Nathan chose not to read it, which is completely fine. But I have said for years now that the reason I work so hard on economic justice is I feel like it's a pretty clean way, a comparatively clean way for white people to work on racial justice.
That's interesting.
So that leads me to
trying to get into groups and tell them, well, here, let me tell you from my white perspective what I think you should do. I don't want to do that. But economic justice done right uplifts everybody, and therefore uplifts more the people who are disproportionately harmed. And that's my justification for this work, my personal justification. So
I'm just wondering, I know we're getting late here, I'll probably have to wrap it up, but I'm just wondering, Are there any institutions that are, weighing in on the side of canceling these debts? And I'm specifically thinking about faith communities as an institution, not just as individuals as we are, but as an institution. Is there anything like that happening? Is there any prospect that might happen?
Tiffany might have the best answer to that.
There's been several resolutions that are coming out across the country from like Cambridge, I think California, we sent one. There's been all these resolutions coming out from local governments to the federal government saying why, like how Philadelphia was the first one saying how students.
AFSC might have been involved.
That could easily be.
So there was actually just the other day a huge debt reveal about all the debt that's owed by institutions themselves, like the schools themselves. So like that added a whole other component. Students have been and others have been organizing to figure out like, how much debt is owed where. But in terms of faith groups, I don't know if on the petition, if there's an organization sign-on option, but I'll kick that up to the national and see if they have anything specific, and I can send it back through Nathan.
Okay.
Because I think that would be wonderful.
You might appeal to the Unitarian on the national level.
Absolutely.
There's a thing called the Service Committee,
Absolutely.
which is very progressive and very active. They might be interested in. They might be willing to,
Here's an article I just found Googling that seems to address your question to some extent. It says I'm reading one quote here, a diverse coalition of over 325 organizations, including civil rights groups, consumer rights orgs, and labor unions have called on President Biden to cancel student debt. This was in February, so it's probably gotten significantly bigger by now.
Yeah.
I don't see any, scanning very quickly, I don't see any named religious organizations, although it does mention religious organizations.
We've been coordinating with the Poor People's Campaign. I don't know if you're familiar,
William
but
Barber.
Yes, and Reverend Liz, we did an event. She did an interview with Astra Taylor recently.
She's
from a collective, and so that's very much appreciated. We'll add that to our action sheet for next time too. I'll try to get a better answer and give people a direction there.
We should probably wrap this up unless anybody else has anything. We're all available.
Yeah, so I guess if you're from the you email me and I can get a hold of Strike Debt, or do you have a website, strikedebt.org?
Our email is on that flyer,
Okay.
strikedebt@gmail.com, and we also have a Tumblr, but the best way to reach us is through the email.
Great.
Nathan, I think that's how you found us.
That's how I found you. Yeah, someone actually from our
Yes.
group suggested I reach out, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for coming. It was a great talk, and the recording of this will be online in about a week. Thanks to Tiffany, JP, and Debbie.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Nathan.
you.
Thanks, Bruce.
A pleasure to spend the afternoon with you all.